Well, this is Morning Live. Thanks for tuning in. If you've just joined us, if you've been with us, we appreciate that. Now, in data released by Stats SA yesterday, the South African economy grew by 0.8% in total in 2018. And that means, of course, that it's slightly beating the estimates, but just slightly. And economists and analysts expected the country's GDP figures to be around 0.6 and 0.7%. But let's discuss this further with Dr Azar Jammine, who is the Chief Economist at Econometrix. Thanks so much for coming through.
Morning, Sakina. Glad to be with you.
So let's talk about the figure that we saw yesterday and what does it really mean? Because here we are, an emerging market economy, and the estimates would say that, you know, we should be growing at around 5%. And yet, over the last decade, our average has been 1.4%. So what do we make of all of this?
It is very worrying. There is no question about it. Yes, we may have derived a little bit of satisfaction from the fact that the economy did not contract in the fourth quarter, which one might have feared could have actually been the case. But the fact is that with 0.8% growth and your population growing at 1.6% per annum, it means average living standards are actually declining.
So we know that we have numerous problems as the South African economy, but let's just look at what we have policy-wise. And fiscal discipline is what we hear over and over again. Is that enough, though? Should we be looking at perhaps something different at this stage?
Well, fiscal discipline is an interesting issue in South Africa because we would not need such fiscal discipline if it were not for the fact that tens, if not hundreds of billions of rands have been lost to the government through corruption. Corruption and state capture essentially entail the government paying more than it ought to procure goods and services so that someone in the middle can actually take the balance and put it in his pocket. And so at the end of the day, the ordinary man in the street is suffering as a consequence.
So speaking about that, and if we take the energy sector as an example, and we look at government debt in this regard, the Eskom story is now, you know, over-documented almost. But I suppose you can't say too much about it given the extent of the problem that the power utility faces. But how do we fix that debt?
Well, we're caught in a catch-22 situation. The problem really stems from the fact that for too many years in the previous decade, electricity tariffs were kept way below cost-reflective levels. So we didn't have enough money with which to build new power stations, Medupi and Kusile. For a few years thereafter, we agreed that tariffs should rise by 25% per annum. And then all of a sudden, because of pressure from government, that process of increasing tariffs to become more cost-reflective ceased. And for the last few years, electricity tariffs have been increasing by far less than ought to have been the case. So the end of the story right now is that the cost of our electricity is less than it is internationally. And as a consequence, we're unable to accommodate the huge expenses required to build new power stations and to maintain existing power stations. Now, tomorrow, NERSA is coming out with answers to whether or not to raise tariffs to the extent that Eskom is now actually requesting. But you've got to understand that the difference between bringing those tariffs to a cost-reflective basis that is in line with electricity tariffs in the rest of the world, that would enable us to have enough money to build new power stations and maintain existing power, that has just expanded over time. And that is the result. As a result, we've had huge debt increasing. On top of that, you've had problems such as corruption and insufficient skills or skills depletion in Eskom and other factors like that.
But how do we change all of this around? How do we find ourselves on a positive trajectory? And perhaps it's worth pointing out some of the problems that we are facing. If you look, for example, at the industrial sector, massive decline there. If you look at some of the social aspects, you know, you've got over 17 million South Africans dependent on social grants. You have more than 11 million South Africans of working age out of a job. How do we turn this around?
There is one thread that goes right through all of these, and that is the fact that the majority of South Africans do not understand what's going wrong. And that is because they are not sufficiently well educated. And at the core of our problems lies the dearth of education. Yes, a lot of it can be attributed to the fact that during the apartheid era, the education levels of previously disadvantaged individuals were suppressed. But we are now 25 years into democracy, and we have fallen behind in terms of our education. Without education, people cannot have the skills to understand what is needed, and they don't have the skills to add the value that the economy requires, so as to give them back an income that is sufficient to actually enable them to live decently. And so that imposes a strain on the small minority of people who are educated and who are earning well to actually provide the money through taxes for the majority who are dependent on those handouts.
And just finally, projections for GDP growth this year?
The consensus forecasts are for about 1.5% growth, but one fears that there are some significant downside risks to this. If the electricity crisis is exacerbated, if the world economy slows down more than people currently expect, even 1.5% may seem pie in the sky. But for the moment, people are hoping for something a little better than the 0.8% that we had in 2018. But even 1.5%, you've got to bear in mind, is less than the growth in the population. In order to achieve what we really do need to achieve, we have to have growth rates in line with the figures that you mentioned, other developing countries growing at 4%, 5%, 6%, such as many of the countries to the north of us who are doing that.
So that's unfortunately where we have to leave it. But thanks so much for helping us wade through some of these figures and try to understand what they mean. Dr Azar Jammine talking to us there about that 0% increase in the gross domestic product, or GDP, that Statistics South Africa actually released yesterday.